From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan. David Feldman, unfortunately, is not with us today. He'll be back next week. But we do have the man of the hour, the reason we're all here to begin with. Mr. Ralph Nader is here. And later in the show, we're going to be talking about what I know is one of David's favorite subjects, which is too bad he's not here. It's food. We're going to be talking with Andrew Kimbrell, the Executive Director of the Center for Food Safety. As always, we will also hear from the corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, we are going to be talking about knowledge, where to get it, how to keep it, and how to use it. Which brings us to our first guest. James Love, in my opinion, is one of the unsung heroes of the consumer movement, or any movement for that matter. He is an intellectual property rights activist, which sounds pretty abstract and wonky. But he, along with the current president of Public Citizen, Rob Weissman, were an instrumental part of the coalition to bring affordable AIDS drugs to Africa and other underdeveloped nations back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, probably saving millions of lives, which, of course, is not abstract and wonky. It's very real. Now, Mr. Love is the director of a nonprofit called Knowledge Ecology International, KEI, an organization that searches for new ways to manage knowledge resources. In 2006, KEI received a MacArthur Award for creative and effective institutions for its work on intellectual property rights. And in 2013, Mr. Love received the EFF Pioneer Award for his work on a UN treaty on copyright exceptions for persons who are blind or have other disabilities. Mr. Love has been an expert in several compulsory licensing cases and is an advocate of delinking R&D costs, research and development costs, from drug prices. It's an honor to welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, James Love. Hello, Mr. Love.
Hello. Well, it's an honor to be on a show with you and with Ralph Nader.
Welcome again, Jamie Love. A little background on Jamie Love, a spectacular career. Someday a book will be written on it. We learned about Jamie Love when he was in Alaska. He'd graduated from high school and went to Alaska. And suddenly we started seeing these brilliant policy papers on oil companies, oil pricing, royalties, and other things. And we're saying, who is this guy? Well, he was so impressive in his impact on the situation in Alaska, and that was when the oil companies were starting to expand there, that we got in touch with him. And to make a long story short, he completely leapfrogged undergraduate college and was admitted to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University with only a high school degree. And after he finished with the Kennedy School, he did his graduate work in economics at Princeton and also was one of the students who exchanged economic ideas with the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz. After he left Princeton, he came down to our center, the Center for Study of Responsive Law, where he started his analysis in two areas. One is drug pricing, and the other was, why is it that the U.S. government, through the National Institutes of Health, funds all these new drug developments and then gives them away to drug companies with no reasonable price provision, i.e. with no control of prices for the patients, and virtually no royalties back to Uncle Sam. And that involved congressional hearings and back and forth. But then it came to all our attention that this incredible price of a cocktail of drugs for AIDS patients of $10,000 a year per patient was totally unaffordable in Africa and other third world countries. And so Jamie Love and later Robert Weissman started traveling all over the world, getting data, connecting with ministries of health. It didn't matter whether they were dictatorships, oligarchies. To make a long story short, they got enough information to critique the U.S. drug companies who said pay or die. You know, pay $10,000 for these cocktail of drugs, many of them sourced with taxpayer-funded research and development out of the National Institutes of Health, or you die. That wasn't the way Jamie Love and Robert Weissman were raised by their parents, and they found a drug company in India who says, we can do it for $300 per patient. And that broke the price of big pharma. Now, I give this rather prolonged introduction in order to define a little bit the kind of spectacular impact of knowledge on policy and power that Jamie Love has been so good at, traveling the world incessantly on behalf of those who would otherwise die, get sick, lose their families because the drugs were too excessively priced. So you want to add to that great fight and how you challenged Al Gore, who was playing footsie on this matter, just to give people the idea of how you really pulled it off, Jamie, with very little media in the United States. Why don't you give a sense of the drama and also where the pricing of the AIDS cocktails of drugs are today?
Well, thank you, Ralph, for that very complimentary and generous introduction. It was really Ralph's suggestion that I work on these issues of drug pricing and the role of the government in funding R&D, as well as these other topics in information. I remember Ralph once, used to talk to me about the very diverse ways which access to knowledge really influences culture, society, political relationships. And that always stuck with me. So it's been a pleasure to be able to work in a nonprofit environment, to work on these policy issues for all these years. A lot of people, I think, are interested in these issues, but it's hard to find the financial support to do this kind of work. When we first started working on these issues of developing countries and trade relationships, where the U.S. government was putting pressure on developing countries on drug patent issues, nobody was funding this kind of work. And it was only the Center for Study of Responsive Law, where I was working with Rob Weissman and for Ralph at the time, who was willing to put any resources into that. And it was because of that we're able to work with the South African government, governments around the world, and NGOs around the world to develop strategies to deal with the trade pressures. The role of Al Gore was really significant because South Africa they'd allowed black people to become part of the government. And under the new government that Nelson Mandela was heading under, the new government, Al Gore was appointed to some commission that was supposed to be co-chaired by the then Vice President of South Africa, Mbeki. So it was the Mbeki-Gore Commission. And Gore was managing this relationship, and he was using this commission and this process of engaging the South Africans to pressure them to block generic drugs in South Africa. And I think to me, it was one of the most shocking things I'd ever run into in my life on politics. I never could have imagined someone, Al Gore, I'd considered a political hero of mine. I mean, he's someone that I'd worked with earlier on getting legislation on access to government information, for example. I knew his staff. I often voted as a Democrat. But to me, this was a real deal breaker. How could you take black people living in Africa who were infected with HIV and put pressure against their interest in that situation? And so we worked at the center, Ralph and Rob and I, on this. But also, one of the critical things in the United States was around 1999 when activists that worked on HIV, not a huge number of people, but a small number of people, Eric Sawyer, Mark Milano, Sharon Ann Lynch, Asia Russell, Paul Davis, a number of other people, even Rachel Maddow for a while actually, began to pay attention to a lot of the issues and actively confront Al Gore during his campaign. And that was really a big thing back in 1999 in terms of changing the position of the Clinton administration toward the end of his second term.
And what was interesting is the net result, of course, from Cipla, which is that the name of the Indian drug firm?
Yes.
Whose drugs then were sold in Africa, saving tens of thousands of lives. What is the price now for 1 year for an AIDS patient?
I think the price now for the more common regimes are, depending on the regime they take, somewhere between $70 and $150 a year, depending on the drugs they're taking. I would say the number of people in developing countries under treatment right now are over 10 million. So in sub-Saharan Africa, I think the numbers were between 10 and 20,000 at the time, and a lot of those were white people. So it was really it's one of the most amazing things. I know that the Obama administration recently submitted some papers to a UN agency saying there was no evidence that weaker intellectual property rights ever provided benefits for poor people. And I contacted Sheriff Palmer at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and I said, did you miss the 10 million people that are now being treated for HIV? And
so that's a great rebuttal. Actually, you went, in other words, before you started working with Rob Weissman and others, John Richard at the center, there were just a few thousand people in Africa who were afflicted with AIDS who could afford treatment. And as you said, most of them are white. And now it's over 10 million people in the third world that are receiving treatment for their AIDS illness. That is a huge example of the power of citizen action, a huge example of why we should never be discouraged and cynical and withdraw, because largely with your very impressive knowledge, memos, petitions, testimony, watching Jamie with government officials who are skeptical is a thing of intellectual beauty, because there's really nobody who can rebut him once he gets underway. So solid is his work. Now, you were reported, Jamie, as flying to Hawaii with the U.S. trade rep for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so to speak, the latest treaty with about 11 Pacific Rim countries. And I call this the latest trade dictatorship treaty. That's what it is, because most of it, in terms of its impact, doesn't deal with quotas and tariffs. It deals with the increase in consumer, environmental, and labor rights by some countries being attacked by other countries with lower standards, oligarchies, dictatorships, as, quote, non-tariff trade barriers, and then they take these countries under the World Trade Organization to secret tribunals in Geneva, and the countries who treat their workers, consumers, environment better very often lose, and that's because that trade is supreme over consumer, worker, and environment. And it is a transnational system of autocratic governments, which you know full well. So the TPP, as it's called, Trans-Pacific Partnership, has not been agreed to yet by the various countries, but President Obama has laid the groundwork for an autocratic procedure called Fast Track. So once he gets it inked with Vietnam and Indonesia and Canada and Peru, etc., he'll send it to Congress maybe in 6 or 8 months, and our globaltradewatch.org, remember that, folks, globaltradewatch.org is ready to defeat it on the merits. Okay, I'm sorry I have to give such a predicate, because so much of what you're doing, Jamie, is not in the news, it's not widely known, it's not widely understood. But with this introduction, jump in on this Trans-Pacific Partnership. What's at stake across the board for ordinary people who are being shut out of the process of decision-making?
That's very good to bring things forward, because if you look at the controversies that were taking place in the 90s, and if you look at in the early 2000 through around 2003, where these issues were debated in the context of HIV, and you had cases, for example, Bill Clinton, where he gave an interview in a movie, Fire in the Blood, where he described this as something that should never happen again, and one of the biggest mistakes he ever made. The TPP is astonishing, because the TPP is much worse than anything we've ever seen before. It takes all of the things that were done in the WTO on patents and really doubles down on them. So it's really a horrible agreement.
For the drug companies, right? They're the big heavies here.
Yeah, what the United States is, if you look at the agreement, I think one conclusion you could make is the United States is willing to travel, is willing to trade away a lot of jobs in the United States in order for higher drug prices for big companies, because we're giving up a lot of the protections for U.S. workers on the one hand, because that's the market access is what different trading negotiators in Mexico or Japan or other places. What we trade for that are things that lock in higher drug prices. But it's designed to be a model. In addition to like the dozen countries that are involved right now, which involve a lot of the world's economy, it's clearly designed to be a much greater global norm. And they're already talking about the Philippines joining, Indonesia joining, Thailand joining, other countries. And so it's hugely consequential. It will really make the Obama administration do unbelievable violence to poor people, not just poor people, but just patients around the world that are affected by this. By the way, this week and next week and through the 15th of October, there's a completely unreported negotiation involving the very bottom countries, the so-called least developed countries. Those are countries like in the Western Hemisphere. Only Haiti qualifies as the least developed countries. Countries like Guatemala are considered too rich for that category. In sub-Saharan Africa, countries like Kenya are considered too rich, but countries that are poor like Ethiopia fit in this category. Well, for least developed countries, completely secretively and by not making any public statements, we know that the Obama administration is one of the major blocks to an agreement that would be made in Nairobi this year in Kenya when the WTO meets to allow drug patents not to apply in least developed countries. And the major opposition right now is the Obama administration.
What are the names of some of the big drug companies that are lobbying behind the scenes? It really seems incredible that an American president, and Bush did the same thing, and Clinton did the same thing, would shred our sovereignty and subordinate our democratic institutions and the way they try to deal with consumer, worker, and environmental protections to the supremacy of corporate global trade. I think people are saying, what in the world is going on here? Trading jobs and industries, exporting them to fascist and communist regimes, and in return, we get higher prices for our pharmaceuticals here. I mean, it's just counterintuitive, Jamie. What is the nature of the infiltration here? I mean, if you didn't know the details like you do, you think money's passing hands. People are getting paid off. What is the nature of the influence that is grotesquely shaping these trade agreements? And it's good that Donald Trump is raising havoc about it. Whatever reasons, at least he says we're being taken to the cleaners as a mild criticism. What is the nature of this hidden power that can turn a president against his own people and poor people abroad?
Well, among the companies that are really lobbying aggressively on these issues, on the intellectual property issues, are some companies you'd expect by their name like Lilly, for example, has been very active in this, in lobbying on this deal. So is Pfizer, so is Merck. Merck's been a very hardline company in a lot of these issues. I mean, there's differences among the companies about how bad they are on these issues, but they're not that much difference between them. And then there's foreign companies like Roche, for example, which is a Swiss company. It's got a huge position of monopoly power in the area of cancer drugs, and particularly for breast cancer. And they're a huge player on these trade agreements, as other companies like GSK in the UK. But, it's the big pharma companies. Then there's companies like General Electric you wouldn't think of. They're a significant player in this because they make medical devices and they make some other things that they push these very aggressive policies on. It's an amazing agreement because as you know, it gives private companies the right to litigate the interpretation of the agreement or the enforcement of the agreement. So the WTO agreement was one thing, but only governments can actually enforce the terms of the WTO agreement. What will be different about the TPP is that Lilly or Pfizer or Roche, different private drug companies, they will be able to sue governments over the interpretation of the agreement and also to enforce the provisions of the agreement.
And again, it's befuddling. What's the nature of this power? I mean, why are they caving in like this? They're supposed to represent us, at least plausibly, in Washington. But this is what I call the biggest corporate coup d'etat in American history. This is why right-wing groups support what you do. You have a left-right alliance against these trade agreements, whether it's NAFTA, World Trade Organization, WTO, or this one coming out of the Pacific. If we had a vote on this, Jamie, after just some clear explanations, I think over 80% of the people would say, are you crazy? Are you standing up for our country, our workers, our consumers, and those poor people overseas who are told pay or die? What's the nature of the influence? Is it lack of media exposés? The New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, they keep talking about it as a trade agreement, when it basically is much more. It's an anti-consumer worker environment sovereignty trade dictatorship agreement, secretly decided by tribunals that have nothing to do with our open courts. They're specially set up.
Well, I think that the corporations that are pushing for this are very influential in the media. For example, Amazon, I think, sees this as opening up areas for them in terms of their business model, the way that they deliver goods and services. I think they're going to see the services component and the electronic commerce component of this agreement, which we have not seen. There's 30 chapters in the agreement. We've only seen a couple of them that have been leaked a few times and over the last 5 years. And we have not seen any text from about 27 of the 30 parts of the agreement. And Amazon, for example, I think sees this, and now they own Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. You have some publishers that are involved in other areas where they may have something that they want to see go forward in the agreement. It's also a really complicated issue for some reporters to interpret and boil down for people. Although I think they could. I mean, who would be for this? Who would think that it's a good idea to give private drug companies the right to sue the U.S. government if we do anything to lower the price of a cancer drug in the United States? Why would you want to give? Because who pays it? If they win the lawsuit, that's just U.S. taxpayers, which are on the hook for paying the extra. money for something like that. So I think it is these corporate interests are involved. In terms of the people, how do they get the influence? Well, there's two principal ways that they get the influence. One is that the companies give money to people that run for office, and that's the most obvious thing, and it's really important. The second thing that happens is the people that work in the trade offices, they're in a revolving door situation. Michael Froman came from Citibank. He worked in a hedge fund. There's the chapter in the trade agreement that has to do with financial services. I think that there's a lot of interest, completely unreported, I think, at this point. But I know that companies like Square, they hired the previous head of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office is now a lobbyist for them. And so that you have banks and electronic commerce firms and e-payment firms, I think, are very much interested in this agreement because they're trying to establish global brands in the financial transactions business. That's one thing. And then Froman himself used to run a hedge fund in developing countries before. I think it's unlikely he'll become a lobbyist when he leaves, but he'll probably be affected by what's in the agreement. But the lower level people, the technical people, it's a complete revolving door. When we talk to people from the Copyright Office or the United States Patent and Trademark Office or the United States Trade Representative, the three major agencies involved in the negotiations on intellectual property rights, there's just a complete revolving door. We're talking to people in the trade office that used to be lobbyists for right holders that are back in the government. And then sometimes we'll talk to them after they leave. So the previous intellectual property negotiator for USTR is now working for the motion picture industry, Stan McCoy. And the person that was the lead negotiator on the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement is now working for AbbVie, a big drug company.
This is what's known as the corporate state. Let me give our listeners a simple example. Not a few months ago, the World Trade Organization issued a ruling that said that our law that requires origin of the meat, where they come from. Look, you go into a supermarket, you want to buy a meat product. There was a law that basically says you're entitled to know where this meat was produced from. Was it in Mexico? Was it in Guatemala? Was it in Peru? Was it in Canada? Was it in the U.S.? Was it in China? It was very popular. It passed overwhelmingly in Congress. Brazil and I think Mexico took us to this secret tribunal in Geneva, and they won. And the confrontation after they won was either the U.S. taxpayer was going to pay a huge amount of money, I heard it could go up into the billions, or the Congress had to repeal the requirement that gave you, the consumer, the right to know in the supermarket where your meat product originated from in terms of companies. The House of Representatives, led by Speaker Boehner, couldn't wait to repeal it because he didn't want to be charged with charging the U.S. taxpayer $1, $2, $3, $4 billion in fines. And I think it's now before the Senate. You see how it works, listeners? When you simplify it and do it accurately, they're doing you in. They're taking away what's left of your power, what's left of our sovereignty. This is a brilliant scheme developed by corporate lawyers. What else would you like to tell our listeners about the prospect of beating this TPP, this Trans-Pacific deal, in the Congress on the merits? Because there's growing rumble of the people as they understand it, left, right, saying, don't you dare. What do you think's going to happen? And what about the presidential candidates? Anybody raising this, Bernie Sanders or others?
It was such a heartbreaker when the trade vote was so close in the Congress. It was just really a handful of half a dozen members of the House of Representatives that made all the difference in the world. So everyone was celebrating at first. We thought we'd really defeated the agreement, and then that it worked on it, and then all of a sudden, there was extraordinary how they turned it around in a week. So
but that's a fast track. That's an up or down vote. Yes. Okay, but to be voted on, it's got to come back next year, right?
Yeah, that's correct. So I think the presidential election is very consequential for this. You do have Bernie Sanders, who's ignited the most interest at the grassroots in the Democratic side, who's openly campaigning against everything that needs to be campaigned against agreement, about the fact that the agreement is not transparent. We haven't seen the text of the thing. There's been unequal access. Corporate lobbyists have access, but the general public does not have access. That it's bad on pharmaceuticals. It's bad on all these other things. So Bernie has been and bad for workers as well. So I think that Bernie has been very good on this. And as you mentioned, Donald Trump has been coming out against the thing. Hillary Clinton has been playing it pretty close to the vest, but she was really actively promoting the agreement while she was the administration, and she was touting what it did in the intellectual property area like numerous times. We've done a video about comparing what her husband, Bill Clinton, said about intellectual property and trade agreements, and then contrasting with what she's been saying when she was in the government. So I think the position that she takes will be important. Certainly what Bernie has been saying has really been, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the debates. If Trump really goes after the agreement, he seems to have influenced what's happening in GOP in a way that I just never would have expected. I mean, it's amazing the impact he's had on the GOP on some issues. So it'll be interesting to see if he's able to connect with the populist base of the Republican Party, which is really, I think, more anti-trade agreement than pro-trade agreement, just as you suggested.
We've been talking with Jamie Love, who is an economist and the director of Knowledge Ecology International, KEI, and who is a global hero, in my judgment. He's saved many, many thousands of lives by beating big pharma and reducing the price of the AIDS drugs and other drugs for poor people overseas. A lot of work left to be done. You need a lot of people supporting you. Give our listeners, in conclusion, Jamie Love, the website, all the ways they can reach you.
We are at keionline.org, and you can write us at info@keionline.org or give us a call at 202-332-2670. We have information about what we do and who works here on our webpage and everything. And we're very excited to work with people that want to change the world on the issues we do. We pick issues that are, in a way, kind of maybe seem kind of obscure to people, but how information is managed and controlled really is critical to all sorts of other issues. And so, including healthcare, but all sorts of other things as well. So I think that we certainly appreciate the opportunity to share that on your program today.
Well, the saying is, information is the currency of democracy, and I would add, secrecy is the curse of democracy. Thank you very, very much, Jamie Love. And to be continued, Jamie's going to be a key figure in this battle coming up. You might want to get more information, spread the word in your various places of work and residence. This is going to be a left-right alliance that's going to shake the country in a presidential year against the TPP, the notorious Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is misnamed. It should be called the Trans-Pacific Trade Dictatorship over our respective democratic institutions. Thank you, Jamie Love.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking to Jamie Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International. For more information on the work he does, go to keionline.org. And if you want to know more about his role in the fight to bring affordable AIDS drugs to Africa, he referred to this in the interview. There is a documentary out there called Fire in the Blood. So check that out, Fire in the Blood. Well, first off, Ralph, my first question about Jamie is that the personal. Did I hear this correctly? He did not go to college. He went from high school to graduate school.
Yeah, it just so impressed the people at Harvard University. It's a graduate school, the Kennedy School. They just said, Don't mess around with being an undergraduate. You're too good for that. We want you. And they actually aggressively recruited him to be a graduate student.
So he was writing policy papers in high school.
Well, he had graduated from high school. He came from Oregon, I believe, to Alaska. Right. He worked with one of the groups we founded called the Alaska Public Interest Research Group. I mean, Jamie's whole career is not a tremendously knowledgeable humanitarian. And not only that, he demonstrates how one person can make a difference. I mean, Knowledge Ecology International is a small group. I think they have less than a dozen people. They have offices in Washington, Geneva, Switzerland, nonprofit, and look at the impact they're having. So knowledge is real power when it is focused and laser beamed where decisions are made, where the media is. A great story. It's amazing the New York Times and others, with all their trivial features on people who misbehave, whether it's entertainers or politicians or athletes, that they have not gotten around to writing the definitive feature on what Jamie Love and his associates, including his wife, Manon, who is an expert in some of these areas as well, have done for the people of the world.
Well, it just amazes me that, people don't know the story. And it's kind of like, when I was saying in the introduction that it sounds wonky, but it makes all the difference in the world. All this stuff that is sort of process-oriented and intellectual property and abstract, it's almost like your work reminds me in auto safety, very unsexy kind of topic at first blush. But then there's an engineering solution, seatbelts, that end up saving tens of thousands of lives. Just like this AIDS, drugs, and Africa issue where, it's intellectual property, it's very abstract. It's not, doesn't have the emotional impact of gay marriage or abortion or any number of important, albeit social issues. But this kind of thing, knowledge and intellectual property, makes all the difference. It does save lives.
It does. Well, it's the use by corporations and their lawyers of technical jargon as a controlling process. They have these obscure technical words, intellectual property. What does that mean to most people? Well, you bring it down practically, it says you're going to pay more for your medicines. That's what intellectual property monopolies mean. That's what this fight is all about. And if you can't afford it, you're going to suffer, whether you're a cancer patient or a tuberculosis patient or a malaria patient or a high blood pressure patient. So we try to bring this technical jargon, which is designed to close you out, people, down to where people live, work, are fearful, are hopeful, are angry at injustice. And that's what we do. I love this word transparency. That's another technical word. What is transparency? It's open government. So why don't you say open government? So
Right.
We got to develop a new language. Get ready for next year, folks, in the U.S. Congress, a showdown. We beat the TPP. They're going to start rolling back all these trade dictatorships, and people will be able to work to strengthen their democracy within the confines of their nation, not trying to deal with some complex secret bureaucracy in Geneva, Switzerland, or elsewhere that can sidestep our courts, our regulatory agencies, and our legislature. And if we don't obey on our knees, they can charge the taxpayer billions of dollars. That's something you can talk to with your conservative and liberal friends. It'll resonate, and the information is on globaltradewatch.org or give Jamie's website.
It's keionline.org. KEI, that's for Knowledge Ecology International. See, even that name is a little, what does that mean? But it's very, Knowledge Ecology. It sounds like almost like an environmental group. keionline.org. So we're going to take a short break and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. Then we'll come back with our next guest, Andrew Kimbrell, who's going to talk to us about, among other things, how safe our food is. Take it away, Russell.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Thursday, September 17, 2015. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission is canceling an in-progress study on cancer risks for populations living near reactor sites, citing cost and expected low value of the overall project. But at least one nuclear watchdog group is charging the agency with being part of a cover-up. Beyond Nuclear said the NRC's decision to drop the study after completing its first phase was outrageous and comes at the expense of public health and safety. Documents recently obtained by Beyond Nuclear reveal a close relationship between NRC staffers and the U.S. National Council on Radiation Protection Measurements, which is funded by the industry and has strong pro-nuclear ties. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, and with Ralph. And remember to subscribe to this program for free on iTunes or Stitcher. And if you've missed any of this episode on the radio, go to our website, ralphnaderradiohour.com, and catch up on what you've missed on this or any of our other 78 programs now, which are archived there. And while you're there, click on the link that will take you to Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2001 to 2015. And Ralph, I just got this email in my inbox this morning, and it says, join Ralph Nader, Rock and Roll Hall of Famer Patti Smith, Senator Richard Blumenthal, historian Eric Foner, and hundreds of others to celebrate the opening of the first ever law museum in the United States, the American Museum of Tort Law. That's going to be Saturday, September 26th of this year, kind of like a week and a half now, 1:30 p.m. at the Gilbert School, which is 200 Williams Avenue in Winsted, Connecticut. Look forward to that, Ralph, I imagine.
Very much so, Steve. We're very excited about it. It's going to be a major communication educational institution to inform people about their rights in courts when they are wrongfully injured, whether by toxic chemicals or whether they are defective drugs or harmful vehicles or the devastating effect of Monsanto. And we are looking forward to this interview coming up with Andy Kimbrell.
Yes. Well, and if that's not enough for the convocation, our very own David Feldman's going to be there. So, I might fly out from LA just to see him. It's located in Winsted, Connecticut, which is halfway between New York and Boston. Go to tortmuseum.org to RSVP or call 202-387-8030. Now, let's move on to what you just mentioned there. Our next guest, Andrew Kimbrell, has quite a resume. He is an internationally recognized public interest attorney, public speaker, and author. He's the founder and executive director of the Center for Food Safety. He's also director of the San Francisco-based Center for Technology Assessment, co-founder of Foundation Earth, and president of the Board of Humane Farm Animal Care that administers the Certified Humane label. As an attorney, Mr. Kimbrell has successfully challenged federal agencies in several historic cases. He initiated the court challenge that resulted in a U.S. Supreme Court victory forcing, for the first time, EPA regulation of greenhouse gases and their impact on climate change. He also pioneered the legal strategy that led to the Supreme Court ruling that DNA is not patentable due to being a product of nature. He has been at the forefront of legal challenges to genetically engineered crops and lawsuits forcing FDA to adopt new food safety regulations. His legal work has also helped maintain the integrity of organic standards. I have to tell you, between Jamie Love and Mr. Kimbrell, we have a couple real unsung heroes here. Welcome, Andrew Kimbrell.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you, Andy. Let's lay it out in terms of genetically engineered food and other crops. Give the world plan, the global plan that Monsanto initiated years ago and has been implementing relentlessly in countries around the world, and then give their claims for genetically engineered crops, and then I want to see your rebuttal.
Well, I think the plan is pretty clear, which is nothing short of taking over the food supply of the world. What Monsanto and friends are doing, and we should always mention Monsanto's friends, which includes Dow and DuPont and Syngenta and BASF and Bayer. We sometimes use Monsanto as shorthand for those other corporations who are doing just as much nasty work. They're all chemical companies, so the original idea was to, and it was very clever, they genetically engineered crops, and about 90% of all genetically engineered crops are engineered this way. They've engineered them to be able to withstand massive dosings of herbicides, otherwise known as weed killers. So if normally you were to aerial spray a field of corn or soy with a weed killer, you'd kill not just the weeds, but all of the corn. But through some clever DNA engineering of bacterial genes, they have made those corn, soy, and cotton plants immune to the herbicide, which means farmers, of course, are spraying all over the world in various areas, huge amounts, massive doses of these toxic herbicides, and now because the plants can withstand them. So it eases their weed control, but meanwhile means hundreds of millions of more of these toxic herbicides are being sold and used, which of course is great for the bottom line of Monsanto and Dow and DuPont, but it's terrible for the rest of us because of the toxic impacts, just not only on our food, but on our water. We've seen it now on insects. We've seen it on non-target organisms. We've also began to see that, Darwin showed up, and so now we have these herbicide-tolerant weeds in about 50% of American farmland. These are weeds that you cannot kill with Roundup. As a matter of fact, now we're going up a cycle of toxic pesticides. So Monsanto and Dow have gotten together with something that has the appropriately militaristic term Enlist. And Enlist is a duo-resistant genetically engineered corn, soy, and cotton. They resist not only 2,4-D, which is an element of Agent Orange, but also glyphosate, which is Roundup.
Just to clarify what's going on here, you're seeing a rebellion of nature against Monsanto's chemicals. In other words, the weeds are becoming super weeds. They are mutating to be resistant. So Monsanto has to develop even more virulent herbicides to plaster all over these agricultural areas. And when you referred to the insects, they're mutating too. There was an article recently by Nassim Taleb, who's the author of that runaway bestseller, Black Swan. He made an interesting argument. Before we get down to your rebuttals, Andy, explain to our listeners the argument he made. He was one of the people who predicted the Wall Street crash. He's a an expert in probability of failures of fragile systems. And he took an interest in GE crops, and he's getting deeper and deeper into it with his colleagues. He teaches at NYU. What was his argument in an article in the New York Times about a month and a half ago?
Yeah, I saw that argument. I would, it's not really something I'm an expert in, but the idea is that Darwin showing up, basically evolution showing up with the survival of the fittest, means that a lot of these weeds now could become absolutely catastrophic. We could have it, and we will now, because the weeds will get resistant to 2,4-D, they will get resistant to dicamba. All the poisons that Monsanto and Dow and DuPont can throw at them, they eventually will obviously become resistant. And it's very important to remember that herbicides are like antibiotics. We are actually at peak herbicides. In other words, we don't have any more weed killers. The reason we're going back from 2,4-D now to dicamba, and we started with Roundup, is that those are old herbicides. We've been using them for decades, but we don't have any new ones. So when the weeds become resistant to them, Ralph, when we have millions and millions of acres, and we're talking about pigweed, which is, the consistency of a baseball bat and 6 feet tall that even combines can't knock over, when that is invading the farmlands of America, the whole system collapses. We're not going to be able to get rid of them with any known herbicide.
Some of these herbicides, Agent Orange, they were used in Vietnam to defolio areas of Vietnam, so our bombs could reach their targets.
And it's kind of ironic, Ralph, because we're actually trying to clean up the 2,4-D in Vietnam now, with the Vietnamese government actually spending money on it. Meanwhile, we're going to be contaminating our own farmlands with 800 million more pounds of this stuff every year, unless we can stop it in the courts, which we're trying to do right now.
Okay.
But here's the plan B.
Yeah. What's the plan?
Okay, plan A is plan A is just a lot of chemicals companies selling a lot more chemicals, and that's what we're seeing now. But they've used this money. Now, remember that a lot of the corn and soy that they're using are biofuels, so they've gotten a huge amount of money by 80-90% of our corn and soy being genetically engineered, like we described. They've used that money to buy up the commercial seeds of the world. So Monsanto right now owns 25% of all the commercial seeds in the world. If you add to that DuPont, Dow, and Bayer, they own close to 60% of all the commercial seeds available in the world.
How does this affect Indian farmers who pass seeds from one to another for centuries? What are they trying to force farmers in India to do? And the farmers are having huge demonstrations against it.
What this means is when they buy up all these seeds, they buy up all these seed dealers around the world now. That's how they've accumulated this, right? They go around, they buy all these seeds from these small seed dealers, and they just buy up the medium-sized ones as well. They don't use all those seeds. They are able then, once they buy up that germplasm, which is the technical word for these seeds, they don't have to use it. Mostly they don't. They're literally buying up their competitor seeds, not using them, and then forcing farmers around the world to only be able to choose the various seeds that they are providing, because they own all of it.
Let's get down to this. Name the crops and roughly how many millions of acres have been planted with these genetically engineered seeds, and how do you challenge Monsanto's claim that, hey, this has been going on for years for corn and soy and et cetera, and doesn't seem to be any problem. Before we get to the claims that Monsanto's making to try to sell this stuff to farmers, what's the acreage, what are the crops, and how do you rebut Monsanto says, we haven't seen any problems yet, other than super weeds, which they can't deny, or super insects?
Right. First is a very important question, which is that we now have about 28.3% of all American farmland is grown in corn, and the vast majority of that, well over 90% of that, is genetically engineered corn. That's 28.3% of all of our agricultural lands. For soy, and again, over 90% of that is genetically engineered, is 25%. Well, that means about over 53% of all of our farmland in America is devoted to corn and soy, almost all of it genetically engineered. And what's important to remember about that is about 45% of corn goes into ethanol. About another 40% goes into feeding these animal factories, all these horrifying factories with 10 billion animals that we use every year. So, and then about another 8 or 9% goes into high fructose corn syrup and others. So only about 3 or 4% of all of that corn, and most of it not genetically engineered, is what we eat. So again, 28+% of our acreage is devoted to corn, and none of it is feeding any human being. And the same is true of soy. about 90% of soy either goes into animal factories or into ethanol. Only a lot of it goes into, again, these byproducts and these processed foods we shouldn't be eating anyway. And then only a tiny percent actually goes to feed people. So this is a nightmare paradigm for agriculture. If the rest of the world were to take on our paradigm, starvation would go skyrocketing exponentially, because we're devoting well over half of our farmland to crops that are very profitable for Monsanto and Dow and the rest of them, but don't create food for anybody. It's monoculturing our fields. They are now awash with these toxic pesticides. As a matter of fact, so much of these herbicides have been used that it has destroyed over 99% of the milkweed in the Midwest, which means we're losing our monarch butterflies. We just filed an Endangered Species Act petition to be able to protect the Monsanto butterfly, just because these fields are so awash with these weed killers. They're killing the milkweed, which the monarchs depend on for their multi-generational path west, or their journey west every year. So this is just a biotic nightmare. It's a wiping out of the flowers of every other living thing in the Midwest to support these highly profitable commodity crops that have nothing to do with feeding people. And it's long past due, Ralph, that we stop looking at acreage as yield and start looking at acreage as nutrition for people. Huge paradigm shift. Got to make that shift, because, we get a lot of yield from these acres, but they're not feeding anybody. Their nutrition value is virtually zero.
Well, we're talking with Andrew Kimbrell, founder and director of the Center for Food Safety. The propaganda from Monsanto is they're doing all this to feed the world's hungry people, because they say it's going to increase yields. I haven't found any evidence that it's increased yields anywhere. Is that true?
Yeah, they're not designed to increase yield. This is what I keep telling people. This is chemical companies selling chemicals. This is not nonprofit organizations trying to feed the world. This is Monsanto we're talking about. This is Dow. This is DuPont. They sell chemicals. They do not increase yield. As a matter of fact, there's a yield drag, meaning less yield, in soy and others, because sometimes the herbicide protection doesn't quite work. This is all about simply selling more of their pesticides. They do not increase yield. They're not reducing pesticides. They're massively increasing the pesticide use. This is all just a cover. This has been a glaze, a PR job that they're doing. As a matter of fact, the more they go around the world, Ralph, and they convince countries to grow these genetically engineered corn and soy that don't feed anybody, the less of that land is actually available to have real crops, diverse crops that actually feed the people.
Andy, we're getting short on time. Let me ask you a few quick questions. One of the things Monsanto claims is that there is no evidence that this is GE crops are harming people. And of course, I remember a brilliant editorial in Scientific American a few years ago denouncing Monsanto and others for preventing independent researchers from testing that thesis, because they'll sue them on the grounds that the researchers are not legally able to use the seeds for experimentation. It's like engineers not even be able to test GM cars because GM won't let them have access to any GM cars. So Shelley Krimsky, who's a professor at Tufts University, has come up with 25 peer-reviewed studies, most of them on animals, showing that there are real risks here over time by eating these genetically engineered food crops. What's your observation on that briefly?
Yeah, well, quickly, there's two threats. One is the massive increase in herbicides, hundreds of millions of more pounds, means that glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, is in our water, is in our food. They've massively increased the residues that are allowed in our fodder, water and food, and I mean EPA has. And the World Health Organization, just a couple of months ago, in a high-level panel, right, including former head of the NIH U.S. Cancer Center, said that Roundup is a probable carcinogen. And they pointed out to tumors in animals. They turned out to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in farmers. They saw that was happening. So they've now declared that Roundup, which is being sprayed everywhere, which is in our water, which is in the bodies of everybody listening to this broadcast, that is now a probable carcinogen. For years, Monsanto said, oh, no, it's safe, not a problem. Wrong. So this is a real serious health issue we have now. And then additionally, there is absolutely no consensus that the new proteins that are in these foods, and every one of these foods has different proteins in it, they've never been tested. There's not a single peer-reviewed study, not one. Not one.
That's very important to remember. Listeners, those of you who want to have study sessions in living rooms, there's a book out about a year ago called The GMO Deception, and it's a collection of articles by some of the leading critics of Monsanto and their allied chemical corporations to clarify a lot of the issues and try to make this an election year issue. It's changing the nature of nature. You don't do that with a monoculture. As Nassim Taleb said, if the tomato in your backyard is rotten, that's just one tomato. But if they make a mistake in a genetically engineered tomato that's being planted all over the world, there can be a disaster for that crop, putting all your eggs in one basket. The last area that I'm sure our listeners are wondering about is how do they hook the farmers on this, and where are the regulators, the Food and Drug Administration and the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Andy Kimbrell?
Oh, well, you know the answer to the last question. They're right in the pockets of the corporations, sadly. We have, unlike European countries and others, we have, as you know, a revolving door where so many of the people that are at USDA have been and at FDA and actually created the regulatory, blank check that they've been given to Monsanto all these years. Most of them come from that corporation or similar ones and then go right back into them, including USDA Secretary Vilsack, who worked for a law firm that represented Monsanto and others in the Supreme Court case that we won on alfalfa. So we know that they're in the pocket there. I think the larger question that I also want to just quickly address is that there are counties and states around the country that have, used their democratic decision-making to say no to these crops.
Andy, we're going to get there because you have good news because of your efforts and others. How do they hook the farmers on this? Is it just convenience? They tell them you don't have to spend. I had a big corn farmer once tell me, when I asked him, why are you taking GE seeds? It doesn't increase yields. He said, I want to spend more time with my wife, meaning he wants to spend less time weeding. Okay, so how do they hook? Right. How do they hook them?
Well, you got it. You got it right, Ralph. That's exactly right. There's no doubt about it that being able to aerial spray your fields with herbicide, with weed killer, we've never had that before in the history of American agriculture. You can just aerial spray these fields. You don't have to be careful with your herbicide use. Normally, you'd have to be careful because if you weren't, you wouldn't just kill the weeds. Herbicides kill everything that's green, so you'd kill your crop. Now you don't have to worry about that. So the problem with that is that with that convenience comes this massive increase, in the herbicide, and ultimately the short-term convenience for these farmers is going to be a long-term nightmare because of these genetically engineered these weeds that are resistant to these genetically engineered.
The super weeds. Okay, the last question. What's going on from Hawaii to New England in terms of the grassroots rebellion against the Monsanto dictatorship of seed control?
Yeah, well, this is exciting. I mean, exciting for me, and I know you, Ralph, for years and years, we've talked about, what's going on with our democracy and Citizens United and all the problems. But at the local and municipal and even state level now, we're seeing a massive democratic uprising against a number of technologies. We're certainly seeing it against fracking. We've got cities and states now that are saying no to these neonic pesticides that are killing the bees. And on this GMO issue, we have the county of the Big Island in Hawaii, the county of Hawaii, saying no to GMOs because they're a center for GMO testing. We saw Maui. 40,000 voters. Monsanto and friends spent $8 million to try to defeat a GMO moratorium on Maui, and they lost. They spent about $435 per voter, and they still lost. We have counties all over California. We have Jackson County and Josephine County in Oregon that have said no to GMOs. We have the state of Vermont that said yes to labeling of GMOs, and that includes Connecticut and Maine that also have laws saying yes to labeling. We have Alaska that said labeling of genetically engineered salmon. So we're seeing this democratic uprising around the country, and there's only one problem with it, which is that these counties, like Hawaii County, like Maui, as in Jackson County, they are then sued by the companies. And they know this is multi-million-dollar litigation. And so they're trying to use this litigation. This includes, by the way, suing counties, which has been done. The energy companies suing the counties have said no to fracking. So they're trying to have a chilling effect on our democracy by saying, if you pass this law against GMOs, if you pass this law against this pesticide or against fracking, we are going to sue you and cost your county millions and millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer money. So it's really really important. There was the Naders Raiders. We had the legal services and the war on poverty. We right now need, and CFS, Center for Food Safety, our lawyers are doing it, and a few others at Earth Justice. We are pro bono lawyers who are going in there and saying, we will defend your democracy. And we are doing that for the Big Island of Hawaii. We are doing that for the island of Kauai. We just did it in Jackson County, and we won. Federal court said that county has the constitutional right to say no to GMOs, even though GMOs are being grown there because it threatens the livelihoods of the farmers there and their health.
What state is
they
that?
sued Vermont. That's
okay.
In Oregon.
Just in conclusion, Andy Kimbrell, how do people reach you? Give all the contact numbers. I think you're going to excite more people to take on these genetic engineering overlords.
Oh, yeah, we do it state by state, county by county. They will be overwhelmed. So contact us. Our website is one word now, Center for Food Safety, one word, centerforfoodsafety.org. And we've got offices in D.C., we have offices in San Francisco, Portland, Oregon, Los Angeles, and Honolulu. So, we love interns. We love people to help us with scientific or other legal work. So anybody who wants to contribute to this really historic fight for the future of food, and not just here, but also around the world, let us know. We're delighted, Ralph, that you've taken this on, and The GMO Deception is a great book. People should read that. And also get on our website. Everything we talked about today, all the science, we got 3 or 4 PhDs that work for us here at Center for Food Safety. So it's good scientific information, good legal information. Check our website, and please get in touch with us.
You've been listening to the super lawyer of super lawyers, Andrew Kimbrell, the director of the Center for Food Safety. If anybody's listening to this program from the federal government or from the corporate world, I challenge you to take on Andy Kimbrell in a public debate. You can never win this debate on the facts, and you can't win it on the important arguments that he has made in courts of law, as well as places like the Commonwealth Club.
I'm so happy to take on that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you again, Andy Kimbrell.
Thank you, Ralph, for being a mentor and a friend all these years. Thank you.
I have to say, I've never heard a more clever and compelling and powerful argument against GMOs. And the thing that I've not really heard elucidated like he did was the idea between yield and nutrition.
That's right.
That they say they increase yields, which is also debatable, but that has nothing to do with the tiny percentage of that's about nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's our show, people. I want to thank our guest today, Jamie Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International. The work he does there can be found at keionline.org. And also thanks to Andrew Kimbrell, the Executive Director of the Center for Food Safety. That's centerforfoodsafety.org. The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt and Matthew Marin. On behalf of David Feldman, my name is Steve Scrovan. We'll talk to you next week, Ralph.
Thank you very much. And listeners, connect with those websites for Jamie Love and Andy Kimbrell. They're heroes, but they need people to support them and work with them at the grassroots where people live, work, and raise their families.